Yo, welcome back to Play Free FC, real conversations with the people who shape the game. This is part of our series with Mark Franek, teacher at YSC Academy, author of American Soccer Nation. In part one, we really laid the foundation. We talked about how soccer in America was never new. The game has been here for more than 150 years, woven through immigrant communities, factory towns, colleges, and local clubs all across the country. And now in part two, we pick up with some of the people who helped shape the game here in the U.S. Guys like Thomas Cahill, as mentioned previously, Archie Stark, the rise of the early American Soccer League, and all the twists and turns that help build the foundation of where the game is today. And honestly, the more you listen to Mark, the more you realize this game has always been here, always simmering, always connected. So excited to bring you part two. As always, big thanks to Philly Soft Pretzel Factory in Langhorne, Hill and C, and Save Site Now for supporting the show. And whatever you do, make sure you grab Mark's book, American Soccer Nation, wherever you buy your book. So I'm really excited to bring back Mark into part two of this conversation around the wonderful book, American Soccer Nation. So let's get back into this, John.
What I found fascinating was there was a meeting that happened here in the U.S., and correct me on who was there, some colleges, and they were discussing kind of bringing the rules into the play. And you had rugby, you had soccer, and it seemed that rugby sort of won. Now, am I incorrect in saying that meeting helped develop the gridiron football that we know today, and that we get so much shit from football about soccer, but yet that's kind of where it happened?
This is a very fascinating series of events that historians don't agree on. And frankly, wait, according to the historians are the keepers of the flame, and they're the ones who are diving into the minutiae and trying to figure out what happened over 150 years ago, right? But to your point, well, okay, what was going on in the United States in the 1850s was the war, primarily, the Civil War, of which, 750,000 plus young men and women from both the North and the South died and lost their lives in this internal battle. So for that period of time, many of the colleges either shut down or completely near dormancy while we were fighting this battle. But what you have happened at the end of the Civil War, where baseball at the time, right before and then during the Civil War, starting to pick up steam and kind of cricket, which you had, if you can. Again, we don't know exactly what was going on. Now I'm roughly going over tidbits of detail that historians have gathered. If you go into the late, you go into 1860, 1863, the laws of the game were established in London, right? But if you take yourself to a high school or a college in 1860 in America, they were playing pre-soccer in some version, right? Just like the Brits. I don't think this can be disputed because there are facts in literary magazines from colleges and yearbooks and stuff in newspapers that talk about games being played on campus sometimes, and also maybe in a local field where you have locals playing some of the college boys. And let's be honest, it's pretty much all, for the most part, in the college and the high schools, the need is at the time. They're American, primarily white kids that are playing with a round ball, trying to do something loosely under the premature, if you will, of the school or the club. And they're trying to move a ball with the feet, sometimes with the hand, over a line or towards a goal to score. Now, historians are going to say, well, that's not soccer. And I'm going to say, well, okay, it's proto soccer then. And what happened, I mean, you're trying to get proto soccer. You're not going to have, the United States did not wake up in January 1st of 1864 and have a meeting at the college and say, okay, we're all going to adopt the laws of the game that are coming over in rule book form by the telegraph. By the way, that's an interesting thing. The telegraph was just invented about, and just remind your listener, there's no phone, there's no internet, there's no fast communication, but the rule books and the immigrants that were coming over post 1863 were carrying with them the laws of the game. My position is in the 1860s early, there were pockets of people, primarily on campus, playing game, had rules, that had scores, that had some way of controlling the event that looked very much like what must have been going on in England in 1863 before their rules were codified. Hence, and get into the details later, there were colleges that were playing each other. Princeton was playing Rutgers. Rutgers a week later came around, played Princeton. Penn was involved. Yale was involved. Harvard was involved in playing each other. And it may have looked proto-rugby, proto-soccer, but the argument to me is that's where this is what makes sense to me, that was the birthplace of American soccer. Historians are going to debate this point, and they're going to say you can't call it that because it didn't exist. If anything, it was mob football or proto-soccer, but they're missing the point that I'm trying to make. There is no doubt that schoolboys in America at the college, several of them, were playing a game that was very similar to the game that really that evolved into the laws of the game. And just because the United States, and I'm going to get to that, charged and changed into proto rugby does not mean that soccer or near soccer like activity weren't happening in 1863. Okay. And even if I was wrong, which I'm not, it's still a better effing story than saying it got started in 1881 in some field outside of a garment factory in Kearney, New Jersey or Falls River. Like, I'm saying, yeah, there was soccer association football got started more there and got established, but it had a few tentative breaths on American college campuses. And I believe that based on my research, but I do understand why historians are going to quibble with it. Now, to the meetings, though, do you want to talk about that? Because that's fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating.
Okay. So you have basically contingents from Rutgers, Penn, Yale, Harvard, Columbia, another extent, Penn, who were starting to play loosely organized inter-campus activities pre-1863. And there were several meetups. They started to talk, well, we need to establish these rules, similar to perhaps what was going on in the Freemasons Club. And they tried to have a meeting in upstate New York, or maybe it's Southern New York, where Harvard refused to attend. So you had like Princeton, Columbia, Yale. I might be missing something. Well, they tried to have this meeting. Okay. Harvard didn't attend. And if Harvard didn't attend, it meant that it would never get off the ground because Harvard at the time was the beacon and the bellwether of everything that was going on. And they were playing footsie with soccer, but also pivoted to more of the rugby style game. And there is evidence that the Harvardians, went to McGill, Canada, and had these couple games up there and down there where they were playing more rugby-esque. Remember, all this is pre-rugby, okay, pre-soccer, if you will, laws of the game. And they tried to establish the code, and it never happened. Then they had another meeting within a year after the laws of the game, and they didn't adopt the laws of the game. And we know that. They didn't adopt the laws of the game. They didn't know exactly what they were pivoted. And this is this real important meeting where Harvard attended, Princeton attended, and Yale. And instead of adopting the laws of the game, they adopted a pre-rugby rule, a handling game. And those rules then evolved over decades to become gridiron football that we know today. Now, to briefly, because I think it's really important, whatever was being played in 1865, 1870, take anything up to the 1900, did not look what people think of gridiron today. I mean, the pass was not even invented and sanctioned until the early 1900s. It involved, right, it involved a bunch of guys on either team pretty much in a scrum moving towards each other and trying to advance the ball, locking their arms and doing all this stuff. It wasn't the football we know today. True, it didn't look like soccer either. But I just want to underscore for the listeners that what was going on in the 1870s was not gridiron football. It was pre-rugby. But it is true that the Harvardians really messed this up, which is why I'm a much more favored Princetonian than I am a Harvardian. I think if the Harvardians would have gotten with the Princetonians who were soccer friendly, we could have had a different soccer future. But there's
Do you
no
think
time.
so? I was going to ask you that, and you made that clear in the book. Like, would it have changed? Are we okay with how? Well, that's a dangerous question, so I'm not going to ask.
No, you can though. You can cut it out. Come on, Freddie.
No, it's like had that meeting gone a different way, and it was more soccer, ball at the feet, using hands, what would the trajectory have been for U.S. soccer versus
Yeah. What
kind
do
of how
you
we
think?
got there?
And what do you, if they would have had this meeting with these four colleges, where they sat around, they said, okay, we need to adopt a code. You have one version already from England. Some of us are playing something close to that or that, and others of us are playing something different that's pre-rugby. You have this meeting, 4 to 5, 10. It's unclear how many people were there and exactly what was discussed. But I'm asking you, as a person who's followed soccer, if that group of young men who are in their late teens or 20s decided to follow the laws of the game version, what could have happened?
I think our trajectory or foundation, let's say, would have been much stronger. And I think everything moving forward would have been completely different trajectories. Listen, fast forwarding through your book, An American like history of soccer, all these ups and downs, it could have been we're all on the same page going into the turn of the century, right? This is post Civil War. One of the big things that you say in the book, there was an anti-English sentiment to a degree because of the support that they gave to Confederates in the Civil War. And so I think there's a lot of things stacking against it. If you have a uniformity in terms of a rule in that level of colleges, I think it's a totally different trajectory. It comes back and people are fighting for it. It's pre-war going into World War One. They sent soccer balls over along with baseball. Like, the game was here. It
Right.
just
And
wasn't.
listen, who are these guys? Because they're all guys and they're all white. Let's just be honest, right? What are they going to do when they graduate from Princeton, Harvard, Columbia? Where are they going to be in their communities a couple years out? What are they going to be doing? Do these people have money? They're going to be business. They're
Yeah,
have already now pivoted to proto gridiron. No, we don't have to complain about it. I mean, I guess soccer people can, but let's
it is
take a
what it
look.
is.
Try to be a historian or even just a garden variety guy drinking a beer, right? If these guys now are going to not follow the laws of the game in college, that game now is dead on arrival on campus, right? Or it's not going anywhere. And that's true. You look like this crazy, like this, the research that I did, it shows the round balls front and center of all these
Yeah,
pro soccer teams. And boom, overnight it changes to the oval ball.
and it's dead on arrival. And now going back to your Kearney Falls Mills reference textile, now that's where the immigrant sort of push
Yeah.
happens.
And let's pause for a moment because the
Yeah,
point is that in the 60s, 60s and 70s, when we're getting going with us, we now have the elite, the power, the people in power, right? Who are going to these schools and graduating. They now have, when they graduate and they go back to their communities with their fathers and their moms and whatever money and persuasion they have in the decades to come, they are not following and choosing association football. They're choosing this gridiron, pre-gridiron thing that quickly gains steam on the college campuses and then starts getting picked up on newspaper who love these games, these rugged games and black and white
yep.
images of padding and violence and this is they pivoted. And I don't think it's a reach to say that was a separation. The young men who were graduating were bringing back to them pre-football, the American gridiron football ideas and money and influence that influence by a negative word. That's just the way it was. And if you weren't on the baseball bandwagon at the time, you were starting to get on the pre-gridiron bandwagon, and soccer and college was virtually dead. But it leads you to what now all historians agree on, and me, I think, is that listen, where was association football being played in the late 70s, 80s? It was now being manifested in the textile industry up and down the four quarters of the East Coast. I call the four quarters. We're basically talking from, Baltimore, Philly, on up to Newark, Kearney, New York City, Brooklyn, Pawtucket, Fall River, Boston. That was the corridor. Where was soccer being played? Yes, it was being played without a doubt in the parking lots and fields adjacent to these garment factories that were really in high gear from the 70s up through the 1920s, where all types of American businesses started getting involved. And who were they? They were primarily first generation or recent immigrants from Scotland, England, and to a lesser degree, Scandinavia and other parts of Europe. Over 52 million immigrants entered into the country during, probably got that number wrong, but they were then bringing with them and playing the game, the association game, and they kept the embers of soccer alive in the last 3 decades of the 1800s.
Can we jump into um can we jump into like Thomas Cahill a little bit, Mr. Bullets himself, and what he meant to the game? Is he undervalued, Mark? Is he
I think so. Did you hear of him before you started these podcasts?
Yeah.
Okay. What did you know a year ago?
Well, a year ago I didn't know anything. I ran across him on the American Game podcast that we were talking about earlier. He's a big part of American soccer history. And he's kept coming back throughout the decades. And I had never heard of him. I've heard of Archie Stark, Walter Barr. I didn't know Spalding had anything to do with anything with soccer. And so that part is fascinating because now we're talking World War One in that area through the next rise of soccer. I'll pause there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thomas William Cahill is the most important soccer administrator in the first 50 to 75 years of our journey. Here's why. This man, with all of his warts and all of his negatives, of which there were many, still ranks up there with perhaps the most pivotal person in the first 50 years of soccer on soil. So let's go to 1900. This gentleman was born in 1863. So what does that make him in 1900? Get this right, 37. But he's 27. He's married. He's living in St. Louis. His dad was a saloon owner, and his mom ran a boarding house. So and he grew up in St. Louis area, the Halifax area, which is this rough and tumble Irish neighborhood where you live, think, swim, or die. And he has already had some altercations lined up under his fuselage for his 27th birthday, but he is engulfed in marital problems, and his wife has moved back into her parents' home. And here we go with Thomas Cahill showing up at his in-laws' house. So Thomas Cahill is 27 years old. He is already he's already racked up under his fuselage a couple fisticuffs and claims of fraud for throwing matches. His dad was a saloon owner. His mom ran a boarding house. Thomas Cahill, grew up in the Cary Patch part of a little bit north of in St. Louis. He's rough and tumble. His marriage is on the rocks. He hasn't really found a suitable profession. I mean, he's in the railroad. He's sort of a conductor. He's putting together some soccer endeavors. He plays a little goalie, late to the game, but he's 27, 28, comes to his father-in-law's house where his wife is. And we know this for a fact because of at least 2 newspaper accounts. An altercation ensued where he got into a scuffle with his father-in-law, who had a gun, pulled a gun, and shot Thomas, I think twice, in the gut. And there's some debate about whether they actually tumbled down the stairs. That might be apocryphal. But in any case, we do know that it was a dramatic event. We do know that Bullets, that is his nickname he had for the rest of life, comes from this altercation, and that both survived, and that both went on the different ways. But that doesn't tell listeners about the man. And I guess one way to describe it, we might want to talk about his accolades maybe, and then perhaps, or like what do you want to know about this soccer administrator?
Well, soccer wasn't even his thing until later in life, from what I understand. Again, you got to keep correcting me on this stuff.
Yo, Eddie, it's good, man. My book comes out on the 28th. I think it's tomorrow. And I know that within the next year or two, I'm going to get hammered on facts that I did wrong, and it's fun. It's boring. So, it's hard to tell these stories, particularly from newspapers that sometimes gets the facts wrong, trying to cover their own event in their own town. Freddie, I mean, this is just a tangent. Like, there's some of these games that have been played in the 1800s and early 1900s that have been covered by newspaper writers from the same town. It's not uncommon to find the scorer and the scorers misrepresented in the same paper being published across town about the same event that was just witnessed the day before, which makes it difficult for historians or anyone to keep all this stuff straight. Thomas Cahill was born in New York City, and he moved when he was 6 to St. Louis, into this Cary Patch area, which is a rough and tumble neighborhood in St. Louis. And it was an Irish neighborhood that was supported by parishioners, at which point we know that St. Louis has always been a hotbed of soccer and have always been the benefit of Irish Catholic and certain religious components that have supported soccer for over 150 years.
Well, you don't include them in your four quarter.
That's true. So listen, I've already been hammered by the historians on this. Before the press went to before the book went to print, I did include the St. Louis, Chicago as a separate corridor. And to the point, when I'm doing that briefly to explain, because it is important, we didn't get to this, but the American Soccer League, which got going from 1921 to 1931, the teams that were involved in that 10-year run of almost fully professional soccer on America's soil went to Philadelphia to Boston, and those corridors where was the original league that existed. It didn't mean that soccer wasn't played in St. Louis. It certainly was. St. Louis was vibrant and had a wonderful, wonderful soccer, but it's not like the St. Louis teams were taking a train every weekend to play teams on the East Coast. They did play in the cups, the FA Cup, occasionally, but there wasn't enough. They weren't close enough for it to be a contiguous quarter. But I just want to underscore for listeners, certainly St. Louis had its own vibrant, almost its own hub, if you will. And to another degree, Chicago and Detroit had their own little version going on. And whether it rivaled or was better or worse, I'm not going to get into that. It existed. But
I think that,
yeah,
I was going to say the word corridor makes sense in that. Yes.
Yeah, like I tried to use the right word. Corridor makes it sound like you're walking down a hallway. And to a degree, for Freddie, like you and I have grown up, I bet, playing in open games or cup games where you have to travel away. You get to know these teams. Like for us, I was Ukrainian Nationals. A lot of times we'd have to play the Baltimore Colts once we got out of the region. Like you can get this sense, even us modern players, of, okay, I'm going to travel. You're not traveling to St. Louis in the first or second round of state. You got to go play the New Jersey team or maybe the Connecticut team or maybe, and imagine that. Our predecessors 100 years ago were doing similar things.
Same thing. I'm playing for VE over 50s, and we're playing Christos in 3 weeks.
There you go. That's a rivalry that goes back probably at least 50 years, right? So who's this Thomas Cahill character, and why does it matter? Remember, at the time, we had a federation in the United States called the American Football Association, AFA. It was founded in 1884 in New York City and then quickly moved its epicenter to Newark, New Jersey. So it was founded in New York City, but then got going. But it was run primarily by the Scottish early immigrants. And it paid a lot of attention and cared very much about what the English FA, at the time, we're talking pre-FIFA, okay? The English FA was the big dog at the time. So our AFA, they didn't seem to have a lot of interest, according to many historians, trying to establish and move the game westward. They were interested perhaps in their own little coterie of soccer teams being supported by the garment districts that were also being populated by many Scots and Brits at the time, but they didn't initially have the vision to really look and trying to grow the game. And if it wasn't a 1-year deal or a 10-year deal, from 1884 up until about 1910, the AFA, run primarily by immigrants, nothing wrong with immigrants, but primarily Scottish, were insular, if you will, and not really interested in expanding the soccer game and making inroads into other populations. And this, of course, was a problem if you're trying to grow the game outside the four corridors or some of the other nodes that were vibrant around the country. So you have this Thomas Cahill figure who didn't play soccer back in St. Louis in the 1800s. But you know what? After he got shot, this is part of the story. He had this kind of road to Damascus moment that Thomas McCabe talks about, that he's recovering in early 90s. He's already been working a little bit with the A.G. Spalding Goods Company. This is very important. The A.G. Spalding Goods Company was interested in spreading its goods. So they were putting money behind people that were embedded within the golf communities, within the gridiron communities were coming up in baseball, of course, and their products. People need to buy balls and boots. So Thomas Cahill in St. Louis started working for them. And when he was recovering, he started getting into these ideas of trying to sponsor visiting teams from England to try to play in St. Louis. These were called the Pilgrims. He was involved in some of these early organizing games. So he's like a facilitator, and he's also working for a company. And around, I think 1910, I could get these dates wrong, he becomes more of a full-time, if you will, participant in what's going on with Spalding, who moves him, Cahill, from St. Louis to New York City to actually have an office on Nassau Street where he is promoting the goods. Now, you have an AFA, which is an older 30-year, they hasn't even done much. They have their own cup called the AFA Cup, and they've done some good stuff on the East Coast, but they're not interested in growing nationally. They're being run by internationals, foreigners, if you talk to other people. And here's Cahill, a bellicose, I mean, nickname bullets plowing headfirst from the beginning. And he tries to get Spalding and the AFA to move in a certain direction, but there's some altercation. They don't want to do it. So there's a lot to this. I don't want to get too much into the weeds of it, but Thomas Cahill in the early teens starts hooking up with some guys in New York City that were running the New York City circuit to start what's called the American Amateur Football Association. I don't want to get into the acronyms because it's going to really confuse people, but let's just call it what it was. It was a rival national organization to the 30-year AFA. It was billed as amateur, but it lost the amateur name almost as soon as it was founded. And in the early teens, this is important. I got to think about this because it's a little bit tricky, but it does explain our founding, the USSF. That American Amateur Football Association was the precursor to eventually what became USSF. So you have the AFA, Scottish, English, immigrant friendly, taking directions, maybe literally from the English FA, and this upstart association with this Thomas Cahill figure that had moved into New York City. And they had the support of this man, Gus Manning, another important figure. Gus, was a Brit, an Englishman, who literally helped the German codify their own FA. I mean, he wrote the early code for the Germans. So he came with a lot of cachet and a lot of connections, and he's a New York guy, teams up with Cahill, would have Spalding behind him, and they established this early association that, again, through various iterations, eventually evolved to the USSF today. So you have, in the teens, two rival American football associations at loggerheads. They're not getting along. And of course, they want to apply for FIFA approval for who's going to, FIFA's starting to pick up steam. And they go to a FIFA Congress. They both send a representative. Gus Manning sends Cahill. The AFA, strangely, sends Frederick Wall, who's not even an American. He's the president of the Football Association from England, right? To be their sponsor. And FIFA, of course, punts. FIFA, of course, is a whole other million podcasts about all the stupid things FIFA has done. They basically say, you guys figure this out. So you go back to the United States and you have these two rival associations meeting in an Astor House. I got that right. Astor House in New York City. And they come to an agreement. But the American Association led by Gus Manning and Cahill gets the stamp from FIFA, which spells the death. It won't happen overnight, but it spells the death knell for the AFA. So they went through a 10-year fighting process where the AFA descended and the eventual USSF name came out on top as we're leading into the 90s. Of course, that name then changed a couple of times as you get up into the 1970s to currently be our own glorious.
There's just so many questions. I'm trying to keep this streamlined. All right. So that's our first official, on the way to USSF, FIFA approved, kind of really the foundation to where we are today.
A lot of growing pains, fits and starts and collapses and near deaths.
So let's jump through that really quickly because it's near and dear to my heart. Archie Stark, one of my best buds, great grandfather is Archie Stark.
Awesome.
He's another, I guess, would you say Mount Rushmore figure of U.S. soccer, or am I going too far in saying something like that? But he's important. What is Archie Stark's contribution to the game? And then take us through that to get to the dark years at NASL, dark years to 1990.
So Thomas Cahill then in the early teens becomes the secretary of the early United States Soccer Federation that gets sanctified by FIFA and spells the death knell of its rival older group, the AFA. They go through 10 years of fighting one another, but a FIFA-sponsored group that's now backed by Gus Manning is going to win out. And we're talking now 10 Lizzies. They're still playing these games. They have rival cup. And then Thomas Cahill, of course, the Grey Cup is important. Now under the auspices of the early, I'm going to say USSF. It wasn't called that then, but just clean it up, the USSF. Under the USF mantle, he creates what we call the Challenge Cup, which is a rival cup, because that's how people make money. If you think about it, cups are how the organizations made money. This is why there's these
Yeah.
fiefdoms that are going on. There's money involved, right? And the only sport that's really making any money in the teens in the United States is baseball. So the world is wide open here. So these two rival groups, USSF with Cahill as the secretary, with Fun, their relationship hasn't yet deteriorated. It will. But Cahill is at the epicenter and at the beginning of a whole series of soccer events for the next 15 years, of which we're only going to get a little bit into, but we're talking roughly 1915 to 1930. Cahill has his thumbprints, his fingerprint on almost every important soccer decision, whether it's the early years of the USSF and the early years of the first fully professional soccer league. Although not everybody was getting paid, there's some people getting paid, but it was a fully functioning league that we're going to get into with Archie Stark from 1921 to 1931. Here you have Thomas Cahill. And of course, he doesn't stay out of trouble. If you want to just look at the police report on him, he has certain
Yeah.
run it. And some historians call him an unrelenting and horrible bully, while other people do find, with all of his faults, some really glorious confidence and barreling forward since the moment that helped put soccer on the map. And he never lived to see it. He died in the 50s. So he died after all this stuff that we're almost getting going, catching fire. He dies in what you know is the wilderness area time in 1950 and 60. The NASL goes on. Well, maybe we can find some good stuff. I celebrate Thomas Cahill, even with all of his warts, because it's a fascinating story. We need a person or people to write books about him. Perhaps he gets into a movie, but he is the single most important person administratively in the first 50 years of soccer.
So he was relatively old then, because my next question is going to be if he lives through a little bit, maybe again, going back to these little points through history and time, he's able to push us through that dark wilderness that we went through in that time
Perhaps.
versus not.
Or perhaps he didn't have the personality, and he was, I think he was 70 or 80 at the time. So, there's a whole other thing that happened in the 20s that would have happened without Thomas Cahill, namely the soccer war and the Great Depression. So even if Thomas Cahill was a different kind of a human being, I'm not sure that soccer would have, it survived right through the 30s, but I'm not sure that much of any one person could have changed the trajectory of soccer because it got hit with that 1-2 punch, 1928 to 29, which is an internal war, which was stupid, which Americans have done time and time again to themselves in the soccer arena. Then which is the Great Depression, which of course is one of the most horrible events in human history that lasted 5-8 years and didn't really mitigate until the United States entered the war and was able to go back to work. But we're back to Archie Stark, if you want to talk about Archie Stark.
I'd love to talk about Archie Stark.
Can you tell me, how do you know, first off, what did you know about him? And you say you have a relative. Let's reset that, or a friend of a relative.
So we'll take a step back. So I moved to Wyckoff, New Jersey, and one of the first people I met here, his name is Richie Santos. Richie is the great grandson of Archie Starks. Richie is from Kearney. Richie grew up playing Kearney High School, Thistle, and is associated with all these names and folks, the Scots Club, that is such historical meaning for so much of American soccer.
With all due respect to Richie and the people who know of him and are related to him and knows stories, like I'm only on the surface of the Archie Stark, right? I'm only relying on what other people have written and just these rich stories that people know. I just hope when people talk about it, write it down. It's one of the things that Americans haven't done so well. Not just the USSF. We haven't recorded our own history and taken it seriously. And if you don't talk about it and you don't write it down, then you give a vacuum or the impression that it never existed or it wasn't important. And we've been fighting that inertia for over 100 years. It has always existed on American soil. Soccer goes back 150 years and rivaled baseball for the first 50 years of existence. It never was extirpated or died out, but we have a long, rich history that should be celebrated, not forgotten or necessarily think that it was fragmented. It was always simmering, but it was always there, and it's been continuous for 150 years. Archie Stark, man, what a phenomenal story this is. Imagine, again, with all due respect to people who know more about him, hopefully we can get to a place where more people will write of him. I could even see a movie with him in the ASL leading up to the American Soccer League, up to the 1930 World Cup. I mean, come on, can Richie Grant, Arthur Blank, can we throw some money into a film here? Come on. So Archie Stark was born in Glasgow, moved to Kearney, New Jersey when he's 13, and starts playing with the Kearney Scots. And maybe there's a bunch of teams in and around that area, but he's 13. He's like the equivalent of a hot shot at the Unions coming, oh my God, this 13, all the MLS team wants him, right? He's that guy. He comes on the field in his late teens and starts playing for these teams that are involved in the two cups that I talked about earlier, the AFA Cup, this rudimentary, quote unquote national cup, and the newer one that Cahill had started, which eventually became the Open Cup. It's called the Challenge Cup now. Now it's called the Open Cup, or to be clear, the Lamar Hunt Open Cup. These two cups, there you go. Yeah. These two cups were pitting the best teams pretty much from the East Coast and a little bit in the Midwest. And these yearly competitions have which Archie quickly comes into those teams as a young teen to become one of the best players on the team, only to be interrupted, of course, by World War I, of which point Archie does serve. And he comes back in 1919, and I think that he gets picked up and signed by Bethlehem Steel, which has its own rich history. But to be brief about it, Bethlehem Steel is the name of a company, first and foremost, that existed in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, about an hour and a half to 2 hours north by early model car. I think you can do it a lot faster now. But their benefactor, their company president, Paul Schwab, the steel magnate, loved soccer, helped build a soccer that engulfed and encompassed another local club that became the Bethlehem Steel, or the Steelmen, the Steel Workers, or the Steel. And in about 1914, 15, 16, starts picking up steam. And they almost never lost a game in the Blue Mountain League. They were just studs. And then in these competitions, they racked up a bunch of wins in these national competitions. For 1919, Bethlehem Steel signs Archie Stark. In 21, there's this new league that was started by benefactors, some baseball men, and some other company owners, not related to the garment industry anymore. We're a little bit past that now. You have soccer really getting the attention of steel manufacturing, boat companies, lumber companies, coal companies, Packard Car, all these American companies. Like today it would be Apple or Facebook. All those kinds of cats then were backing soccer clubs because it cut down on labor strife, and it was just a good thing to do. You got all these workers working really hard for you, and they want to play football. Of course, why wouldn't you sponsor these teams? So yeah, Archie Stark comes back from the war. That makes him about 21 years old. Gets picked up by Bethlehem Steel. I think he gets bought by a New York team that was one of the first 8 teams in that new league called the American Soccer League, the first league in world history to use the word soccer in its title. Fully functioning. You had to put up bonds. You had to have a field. You had to have proper refs under the rules of the game with certain modifications we don't want to get into, but it's fundamentally association football. And he plays for the New York team and leads, I think, that team in goals for that first year. And they don't win. That means New York team don't win. But now let's fast forward to get to the really amazing stuff. In 1923, into 23, he gets bought by the Bethlehem Steel. He gets traded, bought, however that worked back then. And he amasses in the 1924 to 25 year in the ASL, of which there were 48 games, if I'm not mistaken, 44, okay, because there were 12 teams in the league and they played each other 4 times. So there's 12 teams, that's 11 other teams that you have to play 4 times. So 4 times 11 is 44. This is important. In 44 games in 1924 to 1925, he amasses 67 league goals. God. Now, people might say, well, that means the teams in the bottom of the table suck. Well, even if that was true, here's what people don't realize. And this is a really fascinating factoid. This was back before the offsides rules you have to be one side equal to the ball, 2 people behind the ball. It was the rule 3 people behind the ball. Now, Freddie, I cover this in my book. I don't know how it's possible for any referee or set of referees without TV let alone VAR. Back in the days, whether you're in England, Scotland, Germany, Italy, who were playing association rules at the time, which were three people. It's usually a goalie and two others. Okay, they can't even figure it out in VAR. It takes modern technology and three people in a booth to figure out who's offsides with two people
That's
behind the ball.
crazy
Anyway,
fact.
if you're playing against defenses that are falling back, that means he's always struggling against two defenders, probably, in the goal.
1v2.
And he scored 67. How is that?
There's always one worst case. He's 1v2 all the time. It's wild. Yeah.
I think he scored
1v3.
6 hat tricks. He scored 6 hat tricks that year. He racked up another 3 goals in the cup outside the league for whopping 70 goals. And that record still stands today in America as the top most goals in a full professional league by any American at any time in any league. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's only been surpassed by Messi and his glorious run for Barcelona. But in any case, whether you think or agree, which I claim, listen, the top teams in this 12-team league in the early 20s were really good. Now, it's impossible to tell. I don't want to get into the rabbit hole about, well, I'm going to compare this to that. I'm not saying, I'm just saying that you can't tell me that with all these immigrant players, including part of the story, that in the mid-20s, they started recruiting high-paid, players that were still in their prime from abroad, because we're paying double their wages than what was going on in England, Scotland. This team league, not team league, was on a trajectory to put America again, just like what happened back with this unfortunate event, college. This is another tipping point or turning point, if you will, where the league was on a trajectory to become one of the most competitive leagues in the world. And here you have Archie Stark, an American now, racking up 67 goals. And there's another interesting time. In that time, the United States national team played 2 games against Canada and in Ebbets Field, if I'm not mistaken. And this is still in dispute somewhat, but for me, it's clear. Archie Stark, in this 1924-25 time period, scored 5 goals against Canada in a 6-1 thumping. And that, to this day, is still the most goals scored by a single player while wearing American colors. Now, briefly, there's some dispute about whether he actually scored 4 goals, 3, 2, or 1, because you look at all these papers across the country. A lot of them say that different things. But what I've discovered after following the trails of Ed Farnsworth and some other historians is that there's 2 papers that sent men to the field to cover it. And one was New York Times and another, I'm not going to say, maybe Passing Times. They sent people eyewitness accounts. And on the New York Times article the day after, across the top, you can go back and look at this online. You can see across the whole top of the 2-page paper when you open it, Archie Stark scores 5 goals and 5-1, but like a half an inch thing. And the article talks about those 5 goals. And the Passing Times did a similar thing that talks about the 5 goals. So I believe he scored 5 goals. And 67 goals is ridiculous when you have people behind the ball at all times. The next year, okay, the IFAB, that's the rulemaking body, changed the rules to set us on the modern offsides rules, the more of the modern. I mean, there are tweaks to it over time, but that was the fundamental change. 3 people behind the ball to the 2 people behind. That didn't happen until after that goal. Little old Archie Stark, man, kicking butt for 10 years, by the way. He applied his trade that overlapped the 10-year decade, and he was the league's leading goal scorer in that 10-year. I think he scored 300. I may be off by a little bit, but some ridiculous amounts of goals on average, taking him heads above the other goal scorers for the whole 10-year period. What a wonderful thing.
That's insane. Well, thank you for sharing that, because it's near and dear to my heart. I can't wait to have my friends.
Did you know?
I don't want to gloss through this because it's important. 1930, 1950 World Cup, right?
So in 1950, the United States goes into the 1950 World Cup in Brazil. And this is this glorious game, single game of their group games where the United States beat the 3 Lions. What is it? Bella Horizon. I forget the name of it. But the point is that the United States has this glorious one-off game against the 3 Lions that they did not take seriously. And that really was a remarkable feat that some sports writers, and many actually today, call one of the greatest upsets of all time in FIFA competitions. The United States were full of part-time players, maybe, that have been paid semi-professionally. There's a whole movie about it. There's a couple of books written about it. Probably don't want to dwell on it, but the point is we had this moment. And then when they came back, Federation people came back to American soil at the end of July, maybe early August of 1950. Nobody had even known that they had left, which was basically a repeat of what had happened in 1930, where the United States, by the way, came in third place on a 13 team, which is remarkable in that they beat Belgium and Paraguay at the time, a bigwig, which is another wonderful story. I would even point out that the Paraguay game that we won was one of the biggest games in like tournament history in that particular World Cup, because how were our players in 1930 able to get so good? Because they were playing in the ASL for 10 years, and it relatively unheard of. In 1950 now, we limp into that World Cup. We make it, we go down and we win one game. It's a glorious game, but we don't make it out of the group. Now we're home. And now we enter into what people and historians and even us now, with us and our fathers, perhaps, this desert, because it really is a desert. The people who are playing are not being played the highest level, if you will, or the teams deprived that you and I have played on, right? These names like the Ukrainian nationals. I mean, you can go over to every city that has these mostly ethnic based, communities together, semi-pro guys or just guys that maybe graduated from college and combining with immigrants to put on a decent product. But there's no league to speak of. There's no, broadcast. There's no, first off, in America, there's no television. There's to watch games in our soil because there aren't any, and it's not yet cable to watch anything going on in Europe. So you have 1950, 1960, and into the early 60s, you have some promoters, of course, who are bringing over teams into America to play. Lo and behold, man, you bring Santos FC, you bring Manchester United over. Oh, come on, you bring some of these big wigs, and 50, 60, 1,000 people show up to these giant gridiron stadiums because Americans will pay to see good soccer. And of course, just to be brief about it, the 1966 World Cup in England broadcast the end of the games in color. And the craziness that happened in that 1966 World Cup with the TV throwing fuel on the fire and Americans showing how many people in England are going nuts over the game and how many people in America are showing up at least to watch this film where, thousands of people are watching the World Cup starts to excite people with deep pocket. They seem to think, okay, well, maybe there's room for soccer. And that begins a long story of the genesis of the early NASL, which got started 67, 68 after a few bumping heads once again, because Americans can't get together and talk and realize and soccer people, unfortunately, can't realize, this is a big point of my book, we're connected. We need to start with understanding how can we make the pie bigger and not caring about our own individual slice. And then we have to backtrack and waste so much time, money, and energy until we get more towards a certain agreement that let's try to make it better.
I'm curious. We had these impacts or effects or whatever you called them in your book, right? So we have the folks that we just talked about, whether it's Cahill, Starks, even Walter Barr. And I know Joe G got the goal, but Walter Barr is a big, person. But now Pele comes over, and you said Beckenbauer, Best, the Formosa. You got all these players. I mean, heck, you got players from Philadelphia that are playing in the ASL. Randy Garber from Abington. Like, you just all these wonderful people. Let's talk about Pele for a second, though. Like that was everything, right? That was like the fame, the champagne, the parties, the gimmicks, all that jazz, and what that meant to, I guess, really starting to kind of go like hockey stick like this for a minute.
Yeah, you're talking about American soccer, of course, and the Pele effect, right? Yeah. So, this is now we're reaching a period in American soccer history that is much more it's more recent. So just a couple points on it that we all agree on. The North American Soccer League had grand aspirations, but its optics were terrible. And it wasn't all the fault of the people who were trying to put this together. Recall, American had no soccer specific stadiums that could hold 20,000 plus. So the games and the league from 1968 through 84 always had to play in these giant gridiron or baseball stadiums that were just a horrible look for the people that were in the stadium or anybody who was watching on TV, which was rare anyway, because the TV contracts either dried up or the TV's lawyers were always within the NAS. We didn't get that right. And it's not as if we didn't know, because guess what? Thomas Cahill said the same thing back in 1921. Literally, there's a bunch of quotes from him talking about we have to get, top quality fields over here with more American players to prove to the American people that soccer's arrived. That's like what, 50 years ago that he said the same thing.
Right.
So here we are in the NASL, and we have teams that did, the first year the teams were competitive, but they didn't draw a lot of crowds. And then it almost died in 1970. And Woosterman comes in, this transplanted Brit American, who's a little much of an analog to Cahill, another administrator, starts to pull together in his Herculean efforts, gathers Lamar Hunt, wonderful, great supporter of soccer through the decade. But with Lamar Hunt, a collection of other morons, if you will, the soccer morons. I mean, they've been called, these charlatans that come in and don't care. But you're in the middle of the 70s now, right? And the Cosmos, Live Toil and some other people, have the idea that it gains traction that we're going to sign we in the Cosmos and the league, if you will, are going to bring Pelé. I think he's 34 at the time. We're going to pay off his massive tax bill in Brazil. We're going to convince the federation in Brazil to let him go because he's a national icon and all these rules about why he couldn't go to Europe, blah, blah, blah. We get that all ironed out with our legal people and with the Cosmos. And we get him to come into the league and bring his tremendous affability and joy for the game and an esprit. And he arrives on American soil and plays, I think, 2.5 years, helps lead the Cosmos to a victory in bowl. Fills stadiums everywhere he goes. It makes it cool to talk about soccer and starts what will become an avalanche of signing pros nearing the end of their career abroad, the tremendous cachet, which brings into the NASL the first melting pot of players that have a great deal of bravado about their game into the team that was only fully recognized with the Premier League and the Sky Sports deal in 1990, that now we're really having a conglomerate of global superstars. The NASL tried to do it and was years ahead of its time. But you're putting the product with no American players. And I just briefly want to talk about this because anybody could have told the soccer people like you and me, perhaps, and our dads and dads' or even women who love the game, starting to get into it, that it wouldn't have worked. We're going to design a league that's going to have all or almost all foreigners. And the only Americans on the team are going to be the referee, right? And maybe the linesman. And maybe we're going to have a quota for a while. You have to play 2 Americans, maybe 3 with the quota, and they're always stuck in the goal. You're not going to establish any academy teams, right? You're going to screw up every TV deal, and you're going to play every game, probably because you have to, in these horrible facilities with turf, and you're not going to tend to the American issue, which is you have to develop an appreciation for soccer that starts with youth development. How ridiculous is it that there's no youth academy at the Cosmos to speak of, or any of the other teams? How do you think this is ever going to work? So it was doomed to fail for more than one reason. It was a good effort. It was like a shot that careened off the post and into the night sky. And it expired, as it was probably going to happen anyway, for more than one reason in 1984. But for a while there, boy, can you imagine going to a Cosmos games with 75,000 people playing Dallas or Los Angeles or whomever?
Well, I would think that you bring up a really interesting point, which I never really thought through, which is the academy and the development side of it, which I also feel like kind of kept going even to like the USISL before MLS kind of took a hold. That didn't just stop with NASL. The Philadelphia Freedom didn't exactly have their development system was Drexel University, Penn State, University of Penn, right? So that's different. We'll get to that in a second. Also, how about whoever the NASL teams were? If you were playing at Cosmos, there's probably not a lot of people there. So the revenue model must not have been working for all the other teams, unless I forget who played where, but maybe some of these foreigners played some of these other teams, but it wasn't the Cosmos that I met.
Right.
Something like
Let's
that.
go back to the mid 70s, right?
Yes.
You have some teams on there, right? Led by the Cosmos, who now have a contract with the world's best player at the tail end of his career, putting him in Cosmos colors we're not going to get into the stadium. They jumped around the Cosmos, but everywhere Pele went, he brought eyeballs to the game and cachet to the game. It was the biggest thing that had happened to American soccer in 100 years, okay, in the 1970s. And it worked in terms of what the Cosmos were doing. But listen, it started an arms and a foot race that nobody could keep up with the lack of soccer specific stadiums and the lack of interest in developing youth academies leading to these that was only inevitably eventually going to end up in failure. And anybody with some brains about soccer could have seen it coming. Who wants to play in Las Vegas on a turf field when it's 102 degrees? You talk about some of these players about coming in at half, literally putting their feet in a bucket of ice without taking their cleats off. Or after a game, looking on the bottom and the soles of the boot were scorched and burnt off because of the heat. Who wants to watch a game like that? Everybody hated some of these places. The arms race is important because once you have these teams that are not looking out for the long haul and the good of the game, starting to buy expensive imports who may move the needle at home. It's a little bit similar to the DP rule today, the designated player. I mean, some of these players like Pele, Beckenbauer, Cruyff are going to move the needle away from home and certainly at home. But some of these other players that they started buying, not important. There's a bunch of these players that are really good and may have been somewhat known at the time, costing you a fortune. They're not going to move the needle away. How are you going to make your money back? Plus, recall, you get maybe 10,000, 17,000 fans at some of these stadiums that are 70,000. It's just a bad look. It's just not going to work full time, which is again, the MLS people are not dumb. They're in fact pretty smart. And we can talk about later whether you disagree, you hate the product, blah, blah, blah. But there's a lot of bright people before they put the MLS together and started tweaking it after 30 years. You know, this is a failed experiment on American soil. And it was actually the third one. We didn't get this. There was 3 times on American soil. Let's put a pin on it because I think it's interesting. We won't talk about it a lot. From 1884 to 1885, you had baseball teams that tried to start a professional league using their outfields in the winter months. It lasted all of 1 week or 3 months, depending on which historical account it died. Then you had 19.
Didn't he try to feature baseball players on some of those teams?
Yes. You're going to watch your baseball players run around and score goals. And well, that never really got off the ground, but it was a professional endeavor that is historically true. And it failed before it even got off the launch pad. Then you had the 1921 to 31, which people have called the, what is it? The golden era of American golden years. It's, you know, that's be debated. Come on, let's celebrate it. 10 years, we're on track to really become a soccer powerhouse on the international stage. We have fans showing out 10,000, 15,000. That's pretty damn good. If you look at the baseball people, the bottom half of the baseball people in both divisions, if I'm not mistaken, through the 20s, the bottom half of the roster were drawing 5,000 or less. It was only the top 5 teams or so that were making a killing in the baseball world. And here you have soccer nipping at those heels, which is a great story. But it almost died with the internal soccer war and the Great Depression, and now you have the NASL. Yes, so you started this arms race that was only going to end up bankrupting the team. Some teams were able to make some money for a while. These are really great stories about this. They returned the Minnesota Stadium, I forget what it was called at the time, to Bacchanalian Fest, or with very loose or no police presence. They probably were fun in the stadium. They had cheerleaders galore. They had all kinds of gimmicks in the NASL, which drove the Brits nuts. They hate what the Yanks do, and they probably even today, when they look back, they're thinking of the NASL and the crazy little rules. The 35-year-old games can't end in a tie. Oh my God, the horror! FIFA finally figured this out. We didn't end it in a penalty kicks, but we had this 30-yard line drilling penalty kicks for many years that drove FIFA nuts. The Americans, the Yanks were tinkering with the game. It was, unfortunately, I know hindsight's 2020. It really it had very little shot of making it because of probably the combination in my mind, the facilities, arms race, foot race, they were too expensive, too fast growth, and the lack of thinking about the developmental issue of the game for American kids. And that's what we're still trying to figure out even today.
And I think that's probably a great place to pause and come back. We are going to spend a lot more time thinking about how we got to the MLS, the MLS academies, that model, and kind of bringing it full circle to YSC and how that's creating this education, soccer development, awesome human being,
Yeah,
place.
that's great. Let